And now that we have our flip source set up, let's also create a source for our collisions. So I'm going to start by copying the split for the riverbed versus the rocks and pasting this off to the side here. And for our colliders, we generally want them to have some thickness. This riverbed collider is just a thin planar geometry, so let's poly extrude this to add some thickness to it. So after the split riverbed, drop in a poly extrude and display that. And on the poly extrude, you could just crank up the distance, although in this case we would want it to be negative so that it doesn't change the surface of our riverbed here. So I'll flip that to -1. And this looks pretty weird because it only gives us the front extruded face and the sides. It doesn't give us the back automatically. So scroll down your poly extrude options and turn on output back. And even though the surface is reversed here, you could do this, but we don't get very clean extrusions on this kind of noisy riverbed geometry. You can see it is problematic in some areas, so it is a little bit cleaner if instead of using this distance-based extrusion, we just do a manual transform. So I'll set the distance back to 0 and turn on transform extruded front, set the transform space to global, and then set this to translate down 3 units in Y. So this gives us a perfectly clean Y extrusion on this. And then we can combine this with the rocks to generate our collision volume. So drop in the merge, connect the poly extruded riverbed, and the second output of our split, which contains the rocks. So we have these nice pieces of geometry with thickness that will work well for collisions. And ultimately, we'll want both a geometry and a volume representation of this collider. So we can drop in a collision source, connect this to the merge, and on the volume tab, you can set the voxel size for your VDB collision. I'll just leave that at default for the moment, and then drop a couple nulls after the collision source here. One of those I'll call collide geo, and for the other one, I'll call this collide volume. So if you display these, you'll see the collide geo should display pretty fast. That took essentially no time for computation, but the collide volume is going to be pretty slow due to how heavy these rocks are. So I'll display that. Now this collision volume did take us over 1.5 minutes to generate, similar to what we saw before. So you might want to cache this out to disk so that you don't have to regenerate these collisions and such anytime that you open up the scene or flip to the setup or anything like that. However, if you just merge together the collision geometry and the collision volume, it's going to make a mess of things because it'll just mix up all the attributes between them. We ran into a similar thing with the rigid body setups before, and for that, we used the RBD pack so that we could pack this into separate packed containers that will keep all of the attributes intact in each of those. And that had inputs for geometry and constraints and proxies to keep those all separate. And even though we're not dealing with rigid body stuff right now, we could use the RBD pack just to put the collision geometry and volume into their own containers. However, instead of the RBD pack, we can also use the RBD IO, which essentially has our file cache built into it. So let's disconnect our collide geo and volume nulls. And this RBD IO has inputs for geometry, so I'll connect that to the first input of the collision source. And it has input for a proxy, which I'll connect to the collision volume. And I'm not going to worry about the constraints or simulation points inputs here. And then on this RBD IO, I'll set this to save the current frame and turn on load from disk. And I'll point this to our river directory and call this rivercollide.vo1.bgo.sc. Then save out this single frame. And because this RBD IO does its own RBD pack and then file cache and then RBD unpack after that internally inside this node, we can just connect our collide geo null to the geometry output of this RBD IO and our collide volume null to the proxy output. So this gives us a nice way of cleanly caching out our colliders without mixing up the attributes or anything. I'll call this cache collision. And with that collider set up, I'll drop a net box around this as well. Call this flip collider. And then we can move on to setting up the actual flip sim itself.